Not too long ago, I packed my bags and headed to Washington State. 30 years after its television premiere, I was on my way to visit Twin Peaks for the first time, to see the sights, drink some coffee, eat some pie, and breathe some of that fresh northern air I'd heard so much about. The Snoqualmie area, including North Bend and Falls City, for all intents and purposes, is Twin Peaks. Nestled between Mount Si and Rattlesnake Ridge, the cities of Snoqualmie, North Bend, and Falls City represent the fictitious town between two peaks. Filming locations from the saturated and idyllic television show, to the passionate and dark prequel film, to the cold and muted cable series, still exist in various forms throughout this part of the world. The mountains, the woods, logs, diners, intersections, and two lodges. I'd flown to Seattle for the weekend, and after spending a day or so checking out the city, was then primed and ready to see the world created by David Lynch and Mark Frost decades ago. I, of course, awoke to overcast and rain, hopped on the Bainbridge Ferry crossing Puget Sound, and took Highway 305 en route to Paulsbo. After a short drive, I arrived at the must-see Kiana Lodge, which is nicely tucked away between the woods and the waterway. And though Paulsbo is almost 2 hours from the Snoqualmie Valley, I realized it was unquestionably the perfect place to start as I stepped on the shore of Sandy Hook Beach and into the world of Twin Peaks. In addition to the first shot of a varied thrush in the opening credits, this is where the body of Laura Palmer is found by Pete Martell in the 1990 pilot, the seminal moment when the story begins. From that point on, I was walking two different paths. It was, at times, hard to distinguish the Twin Peaks that lived in my imagination versus the ground beneath my feet. The exterior of the Kiana Lodge represents the Blue Pine Lodge, home of the Martells and Josie Packard in the original series, and again makes an appearance in The Return when a second chance is born and Pete gets to go fishing. Shortly after Laura's body is discovered, her father Leland is alerted at his place of employment, the Great Northern Hotel, whose interiors were filmed just feet away inside the main lodge. The decorated walls of the center room are instantly recognizable as the backdrops for the hotel's reception and concierge areas in the pilot, while the Moose Room was utilized for its fireplace and winding staircase. The conference area full of Norwegian prospectors is the lodge's dining room that was remodeled sometime in the mid-2000s. The fireplace remains, but Audrey's alcove, which was also used for Josie Packard in the first scene of the series, is now gone. Also lost in the remodel was the far side of the room, used as the Packard kitchen. A private and accommodating location established in the 1930s as a Seattle summer getaway, the Kiana Lodge primarily hosts weddings, receptions, and the like. And if you want to stop by, it's best to contact the friendly staff ahead of time to make sure there are no conflicts. Not wanting to overstay my welcome or let the magic wear off, I began working my way to the proper town of Twin Peaks, a not too terribly long drive to the Snoqualmie area. I headed south, crossed the Tacoma Narrows Bridge, turned northeast via I-5 and State Route 18, and rolled into the heart of historic Snoqualmie before nightfall. It was still cloudy and raining, but I was there. I was actually in Twin Peaks. That fresh mountain air and smell of trees is no joke, and I took several giant breaths upon arrival. While in search of a giant log, I passed through the Northwest Railway Museum and absorbed some town history. Named after the Snoqualmie Indians that lived in the valley of Mount Si, the town was platted and the famed railway was built in 1889, connecting the area timber trade to the rest of the world. After a short walk in Railroad Park, I came upon the Snoqualmie Centennial log that's showcased in the extended openings of the pilot in Season 2 of the original series. The massive old-growth Douglas fir has since been housed in part of the old Weyerhaeuser mill for protection from vandals and rabid Peaks fans. It was time to wet my whistle, so I walked back down Centennial Trail toward the park's gazebo that happens to be featured in a deleted scene from the pilot. The well-known Easter Park gazebo, filmed on the shore of Malibu Lake in Agora Hills, California, was lost in the Woolsey Fire of November 2018, so this is technically the only Twin Peaks gazebo left in the world, and it still looks fantastic. And so I ended my first day in Twin Peaks at Smokey Joe's Tavern, also known as Elks Point No. 9, Sarah Palmer's favorite hangout. After kicking back a couple of cold ones with some laid-back locals and staff, it became one of my favorites as well. While exploring the bar, whose setup was changed to shoot the scene in The Return, I discovered some intentional and not so intentional Easter eggs around the joint. The sun behind the clouds began to set, so off I went into the rainy night to find a clean, reasonably priced room. I knew the next day was going to be a long one. I began my day early and was prepared for it to be raining again, and it was. My goal was to see some trees, and more trees. Olallie State Park in North Bend was just the place. Mystic mountains, majestic forests, and home to countless shooting spots from the pilot, Fire Walk With Me, and The Return. There are multiple entrances to the park, but the Twin Peaks place to be is the South Fork picnic area by way of I-90 off Homestead Valley Road. And once again, as soon as you roll up, you know you've arrived in Twin Peaks. Well, actually, you're in Deer Meadow. At the base of Olallie Point lies a park ranger's cabin, better known as the Deer Meadow Sheriff Station, workplace of Sheriff Cable and his cronies in Fire Walk With Me. Adjacent to the sheriff station is a structure used as the morgue where Special Agents Chet Desmond and Sam Stanley inspected the murdered Teresa Banks, while the missing pieces features a scene shot on the building's north side. Several yards away is Weeks Falls Trail and the entrance to the woods. Inside this part of Olallie State Park are many, many shooting locations. The body of Teresa Banks floating in Wind River from Fire Walk With Me, Bobby versus the baby laxative and the missing pieces, and more. But this location truly shines as Ghostwood Forest in The Return. There's Stephen and Gersten's psychological collapse at the base of a giant tree, Jerry Horn mentally and physically losing himself, Nido's appearance at and Mr. C's pursuit of the White Lodge portal, and the epic trek by the Twin Peaks lawmen led by Bobby Briggs to Jack Rabbit's palace, the giant base of a fallen tree, which, in our world, continues to decay with the passing of time. It was quiet, the air was fresh and full of fantastic scents, and everything was greener than green. One could easily spend a whole day there, but I didn't because I was wet. Really, really wet. It was time to dry off and warm up with some damn good coffee. So I headed out of Olallie State Park and traveled a short distance to the proper town of North Bend to sit where I've dreamed of sitting for years, in a booth at the Double R Diner. North Bend is another small town about a 5-minute drive from Snoqualmie. It was officially incorporated in 1909 and named North Bend due to its location near the large northward bend of the south and middle fork of the Snoqualmie River. I was full of anticipation and excitement. Then on cue, the sun came out as I pulled up to Tweed's Cafe, also known as the Double R. The diner sits at the corner of Bendigo Boulevard and North Bend Way, near a section of train tracks that run through town. Once again, I was struck. The intersection was fairly busy, the parking lot was full, and everything felt a little closer together than it appears on film, but it's still Twin Peaks, no doubt about it. While the bulk of the original show was filmed on a soundstage in Van Nuys, California, especially the second season in which the diner becomes the biggest restaurant you've ever seen, Tweeds is special because the exteriors and the interiors were filmed in the pilot, Fire Walk With Me, and The Return. The diner is one of the few spots in Washington State that really owns its peakness. They feature a Twin Peaks cherry pie and have maintained the classic R interior retrofit constructed for The Return. Featured fan art and other Twin Peaks decor graces the walls, from promo pics spanning the entire franchise to the original covers of the Wrapped in Plastic fanzine. I, of course, had lunch with pie and coffee before venturing outside to get a better look at the town that had previously only existed in my head. The view from the north side is the well-known exterior shot that's in countless episodes of the original show run. And from the south, there's a cool little spot on the back wall of the diner in the form of a mural for peakies to take pictures. But the west side of the restaurant, also known as the parking lot, is where you'll want to hang out for a minute. From this vantage point, one can view the diner as seen in some great shots from the original series and The Return. The parking lot is also where Laura Palmer is given the picture by the old woman and her grandson in Fire Walk With Me, and watches them walk away toward a railroad crossing in a reverse angle shot. And like the film, if you face the diner in Laura's direction and turn to face the opposite, you will see the same train tracks. And while we're here, across the street from the R parking lot is a building whose second floor was home to the jail cell in the pilot episode. Keeping with evil spirits, I ventured down the road to the Mount Si Motel. This is a dark place in the Twin Peaks story, serving as a filming location 2 separate times as 2 different motels with elements of the supernatural. In Fire Walk With Me, the Blue Diamond Motel is where Leland Palmer flees after discovering his daughter was unexpectedly part of a planned salacious encounter with a creepy appearance by the grandson. It was also used for the Dutchman's, the lodging spot that exists on another plane and houses what's left of the frenetic Philip Jeffries in The Return. I was about to leave North Bend for good, and what better place to take a moment to reflect than to sit on the park bench where the late, great Harry Dean Stanton sat. E.J. Roberts Park opened in 1972 and is overlooked by the breathtaking Mount Si. When white settlers arrived in the valley during the 1850s, one Josiah Uncle Si Merritt built his cabin at the foot of the peak in 1862, that later became known as Uncle Si's Mountain. It was appropriately quiet and peaceful, giving me some time to regroup and gather my thoughts before heading back to the Snoqualmie area for the final stretch of the day. I twisted and turned through wooded roads that seemed all too familiar, and made my first stop back in Snoqualmie at the sign. Everyone knows the sign. Everyone loves the sign. Well, almost everyone. Apparently, there was a replica Welcome to Twin Peaks sign made by the town to celebrate The Return, but was damaged and then later destroyed, possibly by some local hooligans. Even with no sign, or a guy parking his truck directly in my shot, the location is, of course, another must-see. It's the definitive image. The mountains in the distance, the trees, and the road that disappears off the horizon. The titles appear, the theme music swells, and you know you're about to enter Twin Peaks. It also marks the iconic arrival of Special Agent Dale Cooper. Both times. Not too far away is the Twin Peaks Sheriff's Department in the Packard Sawmill. As you approach, you can see the smokestack of the Weyerhaeuser mill that once operated, and the Dirtfish Rally School appears shortly after, complete with a Twin Peaks Sheriff Department Bronco. The paint job is different, but the former mill office turned racing school is definitely recognizable as the sheriff's station, and the remains of Snoqualmie's old mill sit across the way. The area is inaccessible to pedestrians, but one can still get a great view of the massive but dilapidated structure. The Weyerhaeuser Mill opened in 1917 and was a major employer for the area throughout the century. But like the Twin Peaks story, a fire burned its plywood plant to the ground on a freezing night in February 1989, which was soon followed by a closure that had already been in the works. The once operational mill, seen in the opening credits and briefly in the first season of the television show, is now little more than a smokestack as seen 25 years later in The Return. In Twin Peaks world, the Packard Sawmill is not directly across from the sheriff's department, of course, and save for a shot out of the station window in the pilot and a scene in The Return, which may or may not be a continuity error, the two are meant to be in different parts of the town. Entering the Dirtfish Rally School is similar to walking into the Double R Diner. It's definitely different from the show, but you feel right at home. The staff was welcoming as I introduced myself as a Twin Peaks nerd and asked to have a look around. The walls are decorated with driving school uniforms and memorabilia, but the inside has maintained its famous wood paneling and green trim. It felt like I had been there 1,000 times as I walked the halls, explored the offices, and even sat in Lucy's desk. And like the Double R, the interior of the sheriff's department was a soundstage for the bulk of the TV show. But this location remains important because of its extensive use in the original pilot and The Return, as well as some cutscenes from the prequel film. This was the most difficult place to leave during my trip, if I'm being honest. Standing in the presence of two epic locations was certainly an experience. But the day was growing late, so I backtracked a ways down the road for the final stretch. If you're coming out of Snoqualmie to get to the sheriff's station in the sawmill, you'll pass through the intersection of Rainig Road and 396 Drive, seen in Fire Walk With Me and known in Twin Peaks lore as Sparkwood and 21. The infamous spotlight featured throughout the story should be hanging over the road, but unfortunately does not actually exist. This wide curve is where James rockets away into the night, shortly after Laura jumps from his bike and runs into the woods on her way to being murdered. Or not. If you were to follow James around the bend, you'd immediately come up on the Rainig Bridge, morbidly referred to in Twin Peaks as Ronette's Bridge. The old overpass on the former Milwaukee Road Railway still stands as part of the scenic Snoqualmie Valley Trail. In the pilot, Ronette Pulaski is discovered walking across the desolate bridge after surviving an attack by Laura Palmer's killer. Ronette's crossing is also seen in flashbacks in the Season 2 opener and as a callback in the final episode of the original series. My final stop of the day was at another dark place that is also relatively close by, the intersection of Meadowbrook Way and Park Street. Twin Peaks fans know and dread this spot, as it is the location of the road rage incident between Philip Gerard and the Palmers in Fire Walk With Me, and where Richard Horne speeds through the stop sign in The Return's deadly, heartbreaking hit and run. This spooky area has changed somewhat in 30 years. The former Brook Theater, known as Moe's Motor in Fire Walk With Me, is gone, and the original Fat Trout trailer park from the film is now but a field nearby. However, the building used as Gersten Hayward's apartment complex in The Return remains. I understand that this is just where a couple of roads meet in what was once the town of Meadowbrook, but being there was still a little unnerving. Night was approaching and it was time to head toward Falls City. I was ready to eat and hit the hay at another famous spot. awoke at the Roadhouse, favorite watering hole and home of live music in Twin Peaks. Situated at Preston and Redmond Roads, the entrance to Falls City, the Roadhouse in real life is a full-service restaurant and bar with an inn upstairs featuring 6 guest rooms. Falls City's Roadhouse restaurant and inn was originally built as a Prohibition-era eatery known as the Riverside Tavern in 1920, and since 2008 has shared the same name as the famous venue from the series. A deleted scene from the pilot explains that although officially named the Bang Bang Bar, everyone in Twin Peaks calls it the Roadhouse. The interiors were all filmed elsewhere, but the iconic building exterior is prominently showcased in the pilot Fire Walk With Me and The Return. While the Roadhouse is certainly more famous, the shack known as the Bookhouse is incredibly still standing and lives next door. An important part of the Twin Peaks universe, the Bookhouse exterior is actually only on screen a few times throughout the original series. The quick shot from the pilot shows the shack all dressed up, the lit sign, and a row of bikes out front, implying a biker club, later fleshed out as the Bookhouse Boys. An interesting side note, sometime in the 2000s, a fenced-in business was built in front of the shack, making it virtually impossible to achieve the wide shots from the show that include both the Bookhouse and the Roadhouse. I made my way not too far down the road in Falls City in the hopes of visiting Deer Meadow one last time. In Fire Walk With Me and its missing pieces, Hap's Diner is where Special Agents Chet Desmond and Sam Stanley head to grab some grub after the autopsy of Teresa Banks. In the film, the diner is seen at night, and in the deleted scenes, we witness our heroes emerge after the sun comes up. The missing pieces also features a shot of an electrical post across the way in Hap's Diner's parking lot. My time left in Twin Peaks was dwindling, so it was on to the obvious grand finale of Snoqualmie Falls. The gorgeous landmark truly lives up to its name as the premier vibrant force of nature in the show. Part of the celebrated opening of both the original series and The Return, imagery of the falls are associated with the main title sequences. The mighty water carries the opening credits downstream in the original series, and in The Return, we see the falls from a different perspective, an amazing overhead view with the water blending into red curtains and a topsy-turvy chevron floor. Named after the Coast Salish Indians of the area, the hotel known today as the Salish Lodge was built in 1916 as an 8-room inn, remodeled and expanded in 1988, and continues to watch over the falls of the Snoqualmie River. The exterior of the Salish Lodge is of course seen on screen as the Great Northern Hotel. Featured in almost every episode, from different vantage points, at all times of day, in all types of weather, the Grand Hotel that overlooks the falls is another definitive element and archetype of Twin Peaks and the Snoqualmie Valley. By the 1870s, timber was king and there were multiple logging operations in the area. In those days, felled timber would be floated over the falls and down the Snoqualmie River, all the way to Everett and Puget Sound. The construction of the Snoqualmie Falls hydroelectric power plant in the 1890s generated electricity and created jobs, while the region began to flourish. And once again, like Twin Peaks, the logging industry that once defined the region began drying up around the turn of the new century. Another bittersweet reminder that nothing stays the same in this world. Our venues and enterprises will change, and time will continue to crawl. As I drove out of town, I thought of Smokey Joe's, Tweeds, and the Roadhouse, The dreamlike fog I was living in began to lift, reminding me that the people living here are just as real as I am. They have real hopes, real struggles, and probably don't care too terribly much about your favorite TV show. But like most of the country, folks are friendly and accommodating, and especially if you're a Twin Peaks fan, you would be hard-pressed not to have a memorable adventure while in the Snoqualmie Valley. There are indeed two worlds up here, and your experience will ultimately be defined by how well you navigate between them. Not quite ready to let it all go, I stopped in the nearby town of Preston to fill up at Big Ed's gas farm. Seen in the pilot episode that recently celebrated its 30-year anniversary, this shop sat vacant across from an empty house used as Ed and Nadine Hurley's. And then, like a heartbroken biker, I hit the road and followed the river.